Now, and of course, depleted uranium is also used now, as you know, you've undoubtedly heard about depleted uranium weapons that are used in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world. These weapons are very controversial because of the radioactivity of them and whether they should be allowed to be used internationally. When Canada sends its fuel to be enriched out of the country, they basically say, keep the change. You can keep the depleted uranium. We don't want it. So the American military and the other militaries do help themselves to depleted uranium, which is a byproduct of the civilian nuclear production in order to make their munitions. Now, here's a picture of Chalk River from the air. That's where they had the isotope crisis recently. You know the isotope crisis. In fact, last night at 10 o'clock at night, Linda Keane, the chairman of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, was fired because she had the audacity to try and actually be an effective regulator. A regulator is supposed to basically blow the whistle when things are not going right. And the message has clearly been sent that that's not what they want the nuclear regulatory to do. Because, you better be careful. I don't think that you're going to have a very effective nuclear regulator if the message is, don't ever think that you can stop something because of safety reasons. I just have to say briefly that the whole crisis over isotopes at Chalk River was not the fault of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. It was the fault of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. They knew more than 10 years ago that this old 50-year-old reactor, the NRU reactor, was too old to rely upon for producing radioisotopes. And therefore, they designed 2 brand new reactors, which they got funding for. And these reactors were designed and built, and they actually were started back in 2001 and 2002. But you know what? They've never been able to get them working because they made mistakes in the design and they made mistakes in the construction, and they cannot operate those reactors. Those reactors were specifically designed to alleviate any possible shortage of radioisotopes. So they didn't succeed in doing that. Also, it's interesting to note that around the world there are other producers of radioisotopes, and together, all together, they can produce the equivalent of about 250% of the world's demand for radioisotopes. Even if you take away the Canadian part, which is very significant, you still have virtually 100% of all the medical radioisotopes that are needed could be met by the other suppliers. If only the other suppliers had been notified by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited or by Nordion that there was possibility of a prolonged shutdown, they could have easily filled the gap. So this medical radioisotope crisis is, I think, something that you should pay attention to for several reasons. And not the least of which is the fact that they have shown that they can't make these small reactors work properly. Those are the same guys who are designing the big reactors they want to build here. The reactors they want to build here have never been built ever anywhere in the world. They're called advanced CANDU reactors. They are a new design, and they may not be properly designed. There are already indications from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission that there's something a little bit fishy with them. And we have some information about this on our website. If you want to get more information, we can communicate it to you. But it's not clear that these reactors, these new reactors, they're basically conducting an experiment by building these reactors in Alberta, and it's handy to build them here because they can work out the wrinkles, work out the kinks if there are problems, and then they can sell them elsewhere. But you will be the first. Now, what about plutonium reprocessing? Well, plutonium reprocessing, I think I already indicated what that is. That's basically getting the plutonium out of the spent fuel. This is the very first reactor that was built in the United States. It was built for the purpose of producing plutonium, which is the reason why the first reactors were built, even in Canada. The first reactor built in Canada was also built, in part, to produce plutonium. It says here, originally part of an effort to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. The first Canadian reactor was designed by a team of Canadian, British, and French scientists, and so on and so on. That's a bronze plaque at Chalk River, just reminding people how we got into this game in the first place. We got into this game as part of the World War II atomic bomb project. Now, here is a picture of how much plutonium is needed to destroy a city. That is, in fact, a glass paperweight, but the hand holding the glass paperweight is the hand of a man called Richard Rhodes, who wrote the book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And he had this glass paperweight made specially to be exactly the same size as the plutonium core of the Nagasaki bomb. That weighs about 6 kilograms if it was made of plutonium, which it isn't. And that's all you need to blow away a city. Every Canadian reactor produces enough plutonium for many bombs just in every year. So that's what's happening with nuclear power reactors. We're producing this plutonium, which has a 24,000-year half-life, which means thousands of years from now, that plutonium will still be available if anybody wants to dig it up and use it for bombs. That's a problem. That's why they talk about proliferation of nuclear weapons as being a problem with civilian nuclear power. Now, this woman is actually handling, this is how you really handle plutonium. You don't hold it in your hand like that. You use a glove box. The glove box is under negative pressure so that if there's any tiny air leak, the air will go into the box instead of out of the box. Because if that woman were exposed to any dust, it could be very, very damaging and deadly to her health. However, you might be surprised that she can even be that close to it. Well, the reason she can be that close to it is because there are 4 types of atomic radiation, and alpha radiation is what plutonium gives off. It's a non-penetrating form of radiation, so it's actually harmless outside the body. It's only when it gets inside the body that it really does the damage. But it can be deadly inside the body. You know an example? The Russian, Alexander Litvinenko. Alexander Litvinenko, you heard about how he was murdered with a polonium-210, which is a very deadly radioactive substance. It's billions of times more toxic than cyanide. So you might wonder, how on earth could anybody transport that stuff safely? Well, the fact is, it gives off only alpha radiation, and alpha radiation cannot penetrate even through a sheet of paper. So that as long as it's in a sealed vial, not only is it perfectly safe to handle, but it's also undetectable if you smuggle it across the border. Nobody's going to find it. Nobody's going to notice it. It's only when that vial is opened and administered that it becomes deadly. So this is alpha radiation. Here's a picture of a particle of plutonium in the lung tissue of an ape. This was an experimental animal who was forced to breathe plutonium dust and then sacrificed, as they say, in order to see what happens. It's a slide of lung tissue which is put under a microscope. And those little spikes are the tracks of alpha rays given off over a 48-hour period from a speck of plutonium which is invisible. You can't see the plutonium at all in the picture. But there's trillions of atoms in that tiny little speck, and they're constantly disintegrating and giving off these alpha tracks. Each one of those alpha rays is capable of damaging the cells in the area. Those cells which are damaged can develop later into cancers or other ailments. So that's why alpha radiation is particularly dangerous. We know about Alexander Litvinenko. This is a reprocessing plant. The way they get the plutonium out is at a plant like this, and they are talking here in Alberta about using recycling of nuclear fuel. You should be wary of that word recycling when it comes to nuclear fuel, because the only way you can recycle nuclear fuel is to reuse the plutonium. It means that you have to reuse the irradiated fuel, and the only way you can reuse it is to break it open, which is a dirty business, because you release the radioactive gases and so on. So when they talk about recycling nuclear fuel, watch out. That's actually considered to be one of the more dangerous operations in the entire nuclear fuel chain. Well, I'm going to wrap this up now. We have covered a lot of territory. You've been very patient. Thank you very much for your attention. And we'll now turn to questions.
Okay, so we're going to do some questions, and Lindsay has a mic. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and she'll come find you. And just before you ask a question, if I can ask, it looks like there's a lot of questions.